That's great. You alone can rescue. You alone can save. We're thinking about Jesus over the course of these few weeks as we begin this new year. We're thinking about his character, his life, and what it means to be like him and grow more like him day by day. So our series title is To Be Like Jesus. We're thinking about lifelong values that should characterize the lives of Jesus' followers, just as they distinguished his life, as he in turn epitomized his Father's character. Last week we considered Jesus' obedience and his faithfulness, and today we're going to be highlighting his gentleness and his meekness. Two more features of his character that really come to the fore in the two readings that we're going to look at right now. So look out for these two characteristics of gentleness and meekness as I read these two excerpts from the Bible. The first is found in Matthew 12, verses 15 to 21. A large crowd followed Jesus, and he healed all who were ill. He warned them not to tell others about him. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Here is my servant, whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not snuff out, till he has brought justice through to victory. In his name, the nations will put their hope. And then flipping over to Luke chapter 7, verses 11 to 17, where we see Jesus raising a widow's son. Verse 11, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." Then he went up and touched the bier they were carrying him on, and the bearers stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." And the dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. They were all filled with awe and praised God. "A great prophet has appeared among us," they said. "God has come to help his people." This news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding countryside. We thank God for his living word. And if I can get out of that, God, good, there we go. Resting up here if you're freezing. Put that back on my ear. By the age of 6, I was quoting the 18th century theologian and hymn writer, Charles Wesley. Impressed? You needn't be. Gentle Jesus, meek and mild. Look upon a little child. Pity my simplicity. Suffer me to come to thee. My mum used to pray with me and teach me that. And about the age of 6, I would start saying it for myself. Now I'm ringing mum up every night and praying with her and returning the favour. But actually, my grandson went one better than I did. He lives in Canada with his dad and the rest of the family, and by the time he was 6, he was quoting God via the prophet Isaiah as he took to FaceTime and recited part of Isaiah 53 to us at 6 years old, first 10 verses, the 10th of which says this: "He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. And as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth." The gentleness and the meekness of Jesus, as expressed by an 18th century hymn and a prophetic message given 600 years before Jesus even was born. And those two very closely related aspects of human behavior that are focus of our attention this morning. And for the first time this year, I'm splitting my message into 3 bits. We're going to begin by getting our heads around the words. We'll follow that by getting our hearts filled with the qualities. And then we'll finish by looking at getting our hands to live them out. So a good dose of technicality followed by a healthy portion of practicality. And first things first, getting our heads around the words. I am gentle, Jesus said to a crowd of people who'd been following him in Matthew 11:29. What did he mean? We've got to understand that Jesus spoke Aramaic. When the New Testament was written, that Aramaic was translated into Greek, and now we're reading in English. So this has come through 2 or 3 different languages. What did Jesus mean? I am gentle. The Greek word that Matthew used to convey the word that Jesus used is the word pros or praus, spelled P-R-A-U-S, and the Authorized or King James Version translates it here as meek. Whereas the New King James Version and the NIV version, the ESV version, the New Living Translation too, all render it with this word gentle. So clearly these two English terms are very close in meaning. We might even say they're almost twins. Indeed, in my thesaurus, both words crop up in each other's list of synonyms. So to be gentle is to be meek is to be gentle. So we're going to consider them together to try and arrive at the heart of what they both mean for us today. I came across several helpful definitions in the course of my studies this week. Both words carry this sense of strength under control. Strength under control. So for a start, we need to rid our minds of all idea or all hint of weakness when we talk about gentleness and meekness. Both physical and emotional strength have nothing to do with gentleness or meekness. To put it another way, strong people can be every bit as gentle as weak people, with Jesus being a prime example of that. A fellow called Darrell Johnson in his commentary says, although it's a challenge to pin down the exact meaning of the original word Jesus uses, it clearly does not mean no brain, no backbone, no brawn. It clearly does not mean no convictions, no courage. How do we know this? For one simple reason, he says, only 2 people in the Bible are explicitly described by the word Jesus uses, that word gentle, and they were Moses and Jesus himself, neither of whom are what we might call wimps. They were pretty strong people. So we're absolutely not talking about some kind of form of human weakness. You could still be a Royal Marine commando and still be a gentle man or a gentle woman, because both gentleness and meekness are all about strength under control. Another term that's closely linked with gentleness is our English word tender. Not the back end of a steam train, tender. A term that carries ideas of warmth and sympathy and loving generosity. And it's in the mix with words like mercy and compassion. Jesus, our rescuer and king, is all of these things. All of these things. US pastor and author Ray Ortlund put it like this: the one and only time Jesus opened up his chest, so to speak, to reveal his heart, his core being, who he is, and always will be, way down deep. How did Jesus describe his deeper self? Gentle and lowly. Gentleness is just who he is, says Ortlund, at the most profound level of his being. What kind of person would not break a fellow human being who was like a broken reed? What kind of person would not extinguish a smoldering wick of humanity? You know the answer. Someone like Jesus, the strongest and the greatest of men, and yet the gentlest and the meekest of men. It occurred to me that Jesus could have run away from every leper. He could have turned his back on every demoniac. He could have spurned the pleas of every sick and helpless sinner, but he did not. He touched them, he healed them, he delivered them, he saved them. He was gentle beyond the ordinary. Then again, Jesus could have broken every critic, couldn't he? He could have snuffed out every opponent, but he spared them. He forgave them. He was meek with them. His power was under perfect control. Are you getting your head around these words? Gentleness, meekness, they're not unmanly qualities. They're not signs of spinelessness or feebleness. On the contrary, they're indications of deep inner strength and humble self-assurance. One day, one of the synagogue rulers in the area named Jairus came to Jesus, and he fell down at his feet and he pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed," and lived. What happened? Jesus went with him, but he got delayed by a lady who was desperate for healing, who touched the hem of his coat, and Jesus had to deal with her and heal her. And then messengers came from the man's house and said the girl had died. And we're told that overhearing what they said, Jesus told Jairus, "Don't be afraid, just believe." And we're going to see what happened next. I love this clip from the Chosen TV series that accurately, I think, and thoughtfully portrayed what happened next. So if we can run the clip, please, Tim, Sam.
Everyone out.
You heard him.
Boys, take everyone outside.
Right. We were paid to play. You listen to me right now. Come, let's give them a moment.
Michal,
Where were you?
I was finding this mess.
She is dead and you were gone. Why would you just leave us like that?
Trust me. Please trust me and trust him.
What? For what?
Please. I know.
No. No. What are you doing? Just please.
Little lamb. Arise.
Oh, nearly my love. Oh, my love. Are you okay? What's doing? What is it?
Look at
I find that extremely moving, actually. The text kind of appeals to my mind, but pictures appeal to your heart, don't they, very often? And that's meekness. Jesus' submissiveness to the Father as he lifted his eyes to pray. That's gentleness, the calmness and tenderness of his touch and his voice, supreme authority and power under perfect control. So with Jesus' example in mind, let's turn our attention now to getting our hearts filled with those qualities. Our series is titled To Be Like Jesus. As his followers, as part of his family in this 21st century, our great desire and fervent hope is that we're slowly becoming more and more like Jesus in terms of our character, our attitudes, the way that we live our lives. Christ is our pattern. He's our example. He's the person we would most like to be like. So how do we get there? How do we become something that we're naturally not? How do we become even more weak, more gentle, if we're naturally those things already? How do we become even more like Jesus? The risk of sounding very simplistic about this, I'm going to offer a two-step strategy. You'll probably think of other things, but the first of these is being aware of ourselves. Being aware of ourselves. I'll let you into a little secret. It's hardly earth-shattering. It's just something I've never felt the need to share with you before. And it's this. I occasionally look at myself in the mirror to see how tidy I look, to see how coordinated my colours are, to see how long my hair has grown, and it never grows that long these days. It's not that I'm in any danger of wearing my mirror out. It's just that every now and again I like to check my outward appearance. But what about my inner self? How often do I check my inner self? The kind of person that I am, the kind of person that I'm becoming. Have I ever even stopped and asked myself the question, am I gentle enough with people? Am I meek enough in the work that I do for God? And anyway, how reliable are my own opinions on the matter? Am I too soft on myself? Am I too harsh on myself even? Or is the whole business too subjective anyway? Well, taking the first question first, what about my inner self? What's more important, actually, at the end of the day? Is it our outer selves or our inner selves? The matching of our colours or the maturity of our character? So why would I not pause periodically to monitor my progress in my inner self? And as for too lenient or too subjective, we're not without help in this matter. You remember the prayer that David said in the end of that beautiful psalm, Psalm 139. David said this, he said, search me, O God, know my heart. See if there's any offensive way in me and lead me in the life everlasting. Being aware of ourselves. I'm not talking about constant self-examination, constant self-condemnation. I'm just advocating a more deliberate, more intentional approach to God's word, actually, by way of examining ourselves in the light of God's word rather than simply nodding our heads in agreement and then forgetting it. Are you with me? What's more important? Our outer selves, how we look to people on the outside, or what we're like on the inside. We should do a periodic check, I think, on that. And the second step in getting our hearts full of the right qualities is being filled with Jesus. If we want to be like Jesus, if we want to live and speak like Jesus, then we must make sure that we're full of Jesus. As he prepared his friends for his return to the Father, Jesus said to this to them, John 15:5, I am the vine. You are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. A little earlier, he had said, I'll not leave you as orphans. I will come to you. John 14:18. Then he added in John 16:12, when he, the Spirit of truth, comes, he will guide you into all the truth. Which is interesting because when Paul writes to the Galatian Christians, he puts the words spirit and fruit together. And he said this, but the fruit of the Spirit, the fruit of the vine, the Spirit working in us, being in the vine being us. The fruit of that Spirit is love and joy and peace. It's forbearance, that's part of meekness. Kindness, goodness, that's part of gentleness. Faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Put all of this together. These different references. What have we got? We've got the Spirit who is one with Jesus in the Godhead living within us, that we might reproduce the character of Jesus in us by way of forming spiritual fruit in us. And that's how we get our hearts full of these qualities that characterized the Master. It's by abiding him, in him. It's being full of him. It's by way of giving way to him in the warp and woof and ups and downs of life. Paul said to his protege Timothy, pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness. In other words, we need to seek those qualities. We need to work on those qualities. Why? Because they're qualities of Christ. And it was something Paul lived out in his own life. As he said in 2 Corinthians 10:1, by the humility and the gentleness of Christ, I appeal to you. So it's taking that check on how we're doing in this life of faith. It's asking Jesus constantly to fill us with his Spirit and reproduce that wonderful fruit of the Spirit. Getting our heads around the words. The dictionary defines them, but Jesus exemplified them. Tenderness, submissiveness, strength under perfect control. Getting our hearts filled with the qualities by examining and challenging ourselves as we fully cooperate with God's Spirit within us. Came across a lady pastor, a pastor of women she was in a big church in the States. Lovely name, Cynthia Fantasia. That's what she's actually called. Amazing. And she said this, the right choice, the fruit of gentleness, isn't one that comes naturally. Gentleness comes from a life committed to living close to the vine. May I add to that just a little bit by saying not just close to the vine, but actually living in the vine, with the vine living in us. Thirdly and lastly, getting our hearts, our hands to live them out. One thing to understand the meaning of the words. That's good. It's a better thing to have hearts that are full of the qualities in question, but it's way, way better still to have hands that daily live those qualities out and have voices as well. Voices as well that are tempered by their grace. It seems to me, and probably some of you would agree at least, it seems to me that we live in a world, and specifically in a culture at this moment in time, in which the manic pace of life and the pressure to succeed or even just to survive can be a remorseless adversary of the practice and even the perceived value of gentleness. We live in a world in which the manic pace of life, the pressure to succeed, is a remorseless adversary of the practice and value of gentleness. And that's one of the reasons I would suggest why believers should be paragons and churches should be bastions of gentleness and meekness. Must have been the week for strange names. I come across a lady called C. Joybell C., influential writer and mentor. And she made a very interesting observation about all things gentle and tender. So I'm going to quote what she said. She said, "It's the hard things that break. Soft things don't break. It was an epiphany I had today, and I just wonder why it took me so very, very long to see it. You can waste so many years of your life," she said, "trying to become something hard in order not to break. But it's the soft things that can't break. The hard things are the ones that shatter into a million pieces." I sincerely believe that the Church of Jesus needs more soft people in the right sense, not more hard people. It needs more gentle people, not more strident people. It needs more meek people, not in-your-face dictatorial people. It needs more burden-bearing people, not overbearing people. "I choose gentleness," said the much-loved pastor Max Lucado. "Nothing is won by force," he says. "I choose to be gentle. If I raise my voice, may it only be in praise. If I clench my fist, may it only be in prayer. If I make a demand, may it only be of myself." Friends, within 100 yards, probably, unless you'd way out in the sticks, within 100 yards of your front door, there will be a number of bruised reeds and smouldering wicks who desperately need a gentle word, a tender touch. It may actually be that even within a few seats of where you're sat, there's someone who feels the need to know the gentleness of Jesus as expressed through his people. And maybe you're the person to convey that gentleness. Wikipedia describes this fellow, whose name is Chuck Norris, as an outspoken Christian. He's also an actor. He's an expert in martial arts. And I wouldn't like to come upon him if he was in a bad mood on a dark night. Some years ago, after a long day of acting, Chuck Norris went out to a restaurant for dinner, and shortly after sitting down in one of the little booths that American restaurants are often divided into, a stranger approached him and said, "You're sitting in my booth." Sometimes that happens in church. I mustn't go into that. Chuck Norris didn't like this man's tone, but he meekly got up from where he was sitting and moved to another booth. And a few minutes later, the man appeared again. And he said, "You're Chuck Norris, aren't you?" "Yes, I am," the actor replied. "You could have kicked me around just then." "But you didn't," said the stranger, at which Norris proceeded to chat with the man, and he made a friend of him. What a brilliantly Christian way to behave. And yet so many people, so many of God's people, would seemingly prefer to kick one another around. Isn't that sad? Gentleness, meekness. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He's spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He's worthy of death," they answered. And they spat in his face and they struck him with their fists. And others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who hit you?" And he could have turned them into dust with a word. But he didn't. With perfect meekness, he surrendered once again to the will of his Father, and those smouldering wicks in front of him were not broken. And even in the face of the consequent brutality, as he went as a lamb to the slaughter, so Jesus did not take vengeance, was not cruel. To be like Jesus in gentleness and meekness, will those be lifelong values for us? One more quotation before we finish. A man called Sean Thomas, Baptist pastor in the States, said this: "Some people are always looking for the newest and best evangelistic tools. But do you know what?" he said. "The greatest evangelistic tool there is a Christ-like life. A Christ-like life." May God will help us to live one. For his name's sake. Amen.